Welcome, everyone, and thank you for listening to my talk today. I'm sorry I could not be there in person with you all, but I'm looking forward to hearing any thoughts, feedback, or questions that you may have about my presentation, and I'll be sure to leave my contact information at the end in case you would like to reach out and chat with me further. So my name is Dr. Jeremy Johnston, and the title of my talk today is Socially Progressive, Fiscally Conservative, Productive Citizenship, Capitalist Agitprop, and the Young Adult Novel. And the premise of this talk stems from a new theoretical model of young adulthood that I term productive citizenship, a model of young adulthood that I argue exists in much of contemporary YA fiction, and particularly in texts published in the United States. So to kick things off, I'll begin with that term and how I use it. My theorization of the productive citizen stems from recent changes to youth citizenship in the new neoliberal economy. The encouragement of adolescents' active participation in consumer culture, for example, is one such change since the Second World War, as youth now play vital economic roles as both producers and consumers. However, I am primarily concerned with the shift for youth from rights-based citizenship to responsibilities-based citizenship. Today, I contend that adolescents hold specific responsibilities that legitimize their positions as good, productive citizens. These responsibilities include: 1, displaying the motivation to achieve specific goals, i.e. do well in school or earn employment. 2, showing a propensity for self-reliance and individuality. And 3, accepting the translation of systemic, political, and economic concerns into personal psychological issues, and then resolving those issues through individual efforts. Binding these 3 features together is that they are all active forms of citizenship grounded in responsibilities over rights. Rather than focusing on the passive accumulation of rights, such as the ability to drive, enlist in the military, or vote, all things a US citizen of legal age can do, for example, but is not required to do, these expectations are consistently required. Should an adolescent refuse or be unable to uphold the responsibility of these tenets, they become a risk to society, or worse, as literary scholar Ken Baxter reminds us, a threat to be tamed. Part of the contemporary fear towards adolescents, therefore, stems from this worry that they will not become good neoliberal subjects. In this presentation, I contend that across genres, from dystopian texts to realistic novels, much of contemporary YA fiction details the importance of this neoliberal becoming. Specifically, YA novels about adolescent mental health often depict how adolescents must either repress or therapeutically treat their distress, simultaneously developing the characteristics necessary for successful and long-term participation in a neoliberal capitalist economy. Now, I find this model of young adulthood worth examining closely for a few reasons, but there is a core reason I would like to focus on today. Namely, I would like to focus on the fact that in the 21st century, several adolescent/young adult texts find themselves on the forefront of socially progressive issues. Climate change, race and gender-based politics, police violence, teenage mental health concerns, and LGBTQA+ issues, among many others, are just a sample of recent topics narratively explored by current and prominent YA authors. However, despite routinely engaging with such progressive topics, the field of YA literature, at least in the US, often remains inextricably linked to an economic conservatism that erases or conceals the way neoliberal capitalism informs the lives of adolescents. As a result, such novels become prone to embracing a form of pro-capitalist messaging that encourages their teenage protagonists to behave, no matter their social or political struggle, like good neoliberal subjects. And even if neoliberal capitalism is a problem, and to be sure, it does come up in various texts, any solutions or resolutions typically rest upon the individual. Thus, while YA texts may find themselves on the forefront of examining many progressive topics, their affirmation of meritocratic individualism reinforces their commitment to a traditionally economic and political conservatism. And since much of YA fiction today is largely informed by and shaped through the logic of neoliberal capitalism, such texts offer at least a tacit affirmation of productive citizenship as the model of young adulthood encouraged today. Now, before I get too deep into this analysis, I want to be clear that this presentation is not about making moral judgments about these texts or their authors, at least on this particular issue. Instead, I aim to highlight why it is worth it for scholars in the field to note the pervasive ways neoliberal capitalism not only informs the production of literary texts for public consumption, but the ways those narratives are told as well. If adolescent characters are encouraged to grow and develop in certain ways, for example, to think of themselves and others more complexly, or to find the courage to stand up to injustice, then it is worth asking if and how such ways reinforce the status quo. With that said, my presentation today has two goals in mind. First, I'll briefly overview the key pillars of productive citizenship, historicizing the model to some degree. And second, I'll connect it to a range of YA texts. Since my time with you today is relatively brief, I'd like to use this space to provide some breadth to where and how this theory of young adulthood emerges in certain genres such as fantasy, dystopian, and realistic fiction. Now, central to my argument, of course, is an outline of how capitalist logic dictates the lives of 21st century adolescents. Mark Fisher refers to this phenomenon as capitalist realism, the idea that capitalism's all-pervasive presence is taken for granted as the bedrock of our social and economic structures. Unlike the 1970s and 80s, when alternative governing systems such as socialism and communism had a more extensive global presence, today capitalism is considered the only option. Quote, for most people under 20 in Europe and North America, Fisher argues, the lack of alternatives to capitalism is no longer even an issue. Capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. So while theorists such as Frederick Jameson once speculated about the dangers of capitalist logic gripping society's political unconscious, such thinking is now commonplace by today's youth and for many adults as well. In A Brief History of Neoliberalism, geographer David Harvey argues that the current iteration of capitalism's influential presence is neoliberalism. The belief that market exchanges and the logic of free market capitalism is a practical guide for all of human action, which Harvey argues emerges in the 1970s and extends to Ronald Reagan's and Margaret Thatcher's respective economic visions through the 1980s. He defines neoliberalism as, quote, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedom and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. In theory, neoliberal policies are designed to improve human well-being by empowering individuals and limiting the government's role to protecting those individual freedoms. However, what this means in practice is when people experience hardship or distress in a neoliberal capitalist society, they assume personal responsibility for absolving their suffering. The causes of such suffering are likewise displaced onto individuals or families, protecting systemic problems from deep interrogation. So ultimately, what occurs through the 1970s and into the 1980s is a nexus of key political movements. One, the neoliberalization of US capitalism with its insistence on individual accomplishments within a hyper-competitive labor market. Two, the reconstitution of youth citizenship premised upon responsibilities over rights, along with the privatization of those responsibilities. And three, the intervention of self-help and therapeutic treatments as suitable responses to personal distress, regardless of that distress's connection to broader political and social issues. The convergence of these three features informs the model of productive citizenship as I conceive of it. And at the center of my analysis of this model is the literary adolescent, simultaneously that symbol of crisis and beacon of hope for the future. Through the depiction of literary adolescence, many of today's political expectations and problems within the US come into focus, with the productive citizen emerging as the 21st century model of young adulthood. So with all this in mind, I'd like to turn now to the literature itself. How and where does this model of young adulthood emerge? I argue that its emergence is not genre specific, but that some genres are certainly quite prone or uniquely kind of prone to more explicit forms of this neoliberal messaging. For example, take realistic novels where adolescent mental health is central to their narratives, such as Ned Vizzini's It's Kind of a Funny Story or Francisco X. Stark's The Memory of Light. The protagonists of these novels and their personal development as autonomous subjects are deeply guided by a logic of neoliberal agency. Craig Gilner and Vicky Cruz, the protagonists of these respective novels, both suffer depression and experience suicidal ideation due to the pressures and expectations of living life within a capitalist society, which lead them both to extended hospital stays designed to help them recalibrate themselves and return to society as contributing productive citizens. Capitalist logic and competitive individualism govern their lives in nearly every way, and they must reconcile their thoughts and emotions about the neoliberal expectations shaping their experiences, while those same expectations chip away at their mental health and their overall will to live. Of course, through the therapeutic process, or though it's not easy, they inevitably find a way to grow and return to their worlds ready to handle such pressures in a better way, implying that the issue was with them all along. It wasn't the capitalist pressures that were bad or making their lives worse somehow, or at least enough to warrant a change, but it was their inability to handle such pressures adequately. This neoliberal sentiment, of course, easily translates genres. In one of the most popular fantasy series of all time, the Harry Potter series, much emphasis is placed upon the value of individual responsibility over systemic change. Beyond being a generational symbol of the chosen one narrative and its emphasis on a special kind of individuality, the whole Harry Potter series falls neatly within the neoliberal ideology embraced by Stork's text. In a recent video essay in literary analysis, which notably has about 2.3 million views at the time of this recording, the YouTuber Sean examines the roles of neoliberalism and personal responsibility within the Harry Potter series, noting that the series' depiction of slavery is one major area where it's clearly communicated that the system of slavery within the wizarding world itself is not bad on a systemic level, but rather it is made bad by individuals who abuse the system. Sean then parallels this analysis with the Ministry of Magic, another systemic force within the series, wherein the flaws are related to individuals, not the system itself. Thus, quote, while flawed systems are portrayed, the answer to those flaws is always to replace the individuals assumed to be responsible for them. The system itself is above being questioned. Furthermore, this is the result, Sean concludes, of an automatic, unthinking respect given to the status quo. The political and social systems that currently exist are treated as fundamental forces that are inherent to the world. They must never be questioned. Now, even if we turn to dystopian novels that more explicitly critique systems of oppression while entertaining the possibility for systemic revolution, Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games trilogy, for example, we still see a series which remains ensnared by the dominant neoliberal ideology of today. As Barbara Foley notes of the series, quote, the protagonist, Katniss Everdeen, may eschew high-heeled shoes and gem-encrusted gowns, but she wows her audience with a graceful twirl that would have won her a perfect score on American Idol. She detests competition, but overwhelms the judges with her archery skills. What this means, Foley concludes, is that, quote, although it takes the death of an ally to commit Katniss to winning the Hunger Games, when she does, along the way killing several other tributes. Collins' young adult readers of the trilogy can thus comfortably admire this rebel against the status quo, even as her tale affirms meritocracy and competition as intrinsic to success. So what we have here is a collection of very distinct texts within a range of genres that, despite their differences, and there are many, openly examine the relationship between individual characters and the various systems of which they are embedded. Yet at best, if those systems must fall, then the neoliberal adolescent must be raised. And at worst, those systems will remain intact while individual characters must adjust themselves accordingly. The protagonists of these novels succeed in their goals, whatever they may be, at least in part because they model the characteristics of productive citizenship. They assume some level of individual responsibility for larger systemic issues, and their lives are all made better for it. Thus, I conclude this presentation by noting how imperative it is for us as scholars and educators to continually examine the ways the logic of neoliberal capitalism shapes and informs the field of YA fiction, and what aspects of the status quo remain upheld within its texts, lest it continues to rest within the domain of being socially progressive but fiscally conservative. So thank you for listening. I'm going to put my contact information on the screen now. You can get a hold of me via email or via social media. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Here is my works cited will be as followed. Thank you again. And I look forward to hearing from you. Take care.